So, how sustainable is capitalism? Well, this is a very thorny question, and indeed could cover many hours of a course like this. Of course, we don't have time for that. When it comes to how we take care of our home, planet Earth, opinions understandably run deep and run high. And it's fair to say that there is a very wide spectrum of opinions about how sustainable capitalism is. Some would argue that we need more extreme capitalism, by which we now understand we mean more private ownership. That many of the problems that we face, this century in particular, would be best solved by having, for example, every CO2 molecule have a clearly prescribed owner. For example, there's a Chinese one, there's an American one. Every fish in the ocean had a clear owner. Then many of the problems that we face would at the very least be lessened. Others argue that this line of thinking is actually exactly what got us into this predicament in the first place, and that we need other solutions, be they a more centralized approach through a larger role for central governments or distributed collective decision makers, or perhaps something radically different, something we haven't tried before. Others might point out that solving the problem of sustainability shouldn't start with tinkering with economic systems, that we're better off looking at human nature first and foremost. Behavioral economists, for example, would argue that what we need to do is understand how and why humans tend to discount the future at the cost of future generations. How we're not evolved to deal with global, steadily worsening calamities like anthropogenic climate change. And how we're creatures of habit, and how it's really, really difficult, even if the market incentives are there, for us to change the way we behave, for example, in how we use energy. Behind me, you can see the remains of the Cockenzie coal power station being demolished, as you can see. At 1200 megawatts, this was once considered the United Kingdom's most polluting power station, including by some of the metrics we discussed earlier. It was built, conceived, designed and operated, starting in the mid-60s, in a regime under which energy was considered the province of central government. Then, under widespread energy industry privatization, starting in the early 90s, ownership and control of Cockenzie fell in the hands of Scottish Power, a subsidiary of a big Spanish company called Iberdrola. Scotland has set herself very ambitious emissions reductions and decarbonization targets. But what kind of technologies are going to fill the void left by polluting power stations like Cockenzie, or by Longannet, which just across the fjord was the last coal power station in Scotland, just closed 2 weeks ago. Will the reigning political and economic system be able to provide the energy mix of the future? This remains an open question. You can see a wind turbine behind me, but will the economic system as it currently stands be able to provide the storage technologies that are needed to deal with the big intermittency problems that many renewable energy technologies have? In some ways, cracks are already showing in the current system. How do we deal with technologies that have zero or very low marginal cost, which means the cost of producing an extra unit? Examples like wind, hydro and solar energy, but also in information technologies. Information, an added unit of information, costs next to nothing. And our current economic system doesn't seem well poised to deal with this, as thinkers like Jeremy Rifkin and Paul Mason have pointed out. The truth of the matter is that we don't really know yet, hopefully, what a more sustainable economic system might look like. What we do know is that command and control economies of the past haven't exactly been shiny green examples of sustainability. Many of these were some of the most carbon-intensive economies in history. But then there's examples like Cuba, which by many of the measures that we've discussed earlier has done very well when it comes to sustainability indicators, at least. Of course, very few people would pay the price of very low growth at the cost of mitigating looming problems like climate change, as we can see from the large number of Cubans that would prefer to live in the United States, where wealth and inequality are significantly higher than in Cuba. And then there's also the example of the not exactly socialist, not exactly capitalist China. Although China faces massive pollution problems, there's good things happening too. It's estimated that China invested more in renewable energy over the past few years than the rest of the world combined. And it also looks like Chinese coal production might have peaked and is now on the way down. Some call for moving more towards what's often called a circular economy. You can learn more about this in the video that follows this talk. Although it remains to be seen how we would design a market regime to establish the appropriate price signals and incentives where this would actually start happening at the sort of scale that seems to be required. There's also an important equity, some people speak of climate justice issue here. It seems clear that poorer people and future generations are going to be suffering disproportionately from emissions by people in rich countries like this one. Undoubtedly, tremendous change is needed if we want to get anywhere close to the 2 degrees Celsius target that was agreed at the famous climate conference in Paris in late 2015. And how we allocate Earth's resources, the domain of economics in other words, is undoubtedly going to become ever more important. As you can tell, I don't pretend to have any of the answers. And I would be suspicious of anyone that thinks they do. The fact is that a large part of the work remains to be done by the thinkers, engineers, and policymakers of the future. People like you, in other words. This graph shows the relationship between CO2 emitted per person on the y-axis and gross domestic product, the size of an economy per person, on the x-axis. As you can see, there exists a strong positive correlation between the two. Generally, the wealthier are the citizens in a given country, the higher are the average emissions per person. One of the big challenges facing economic systems in the 21st century is, can we shift to the bottom right on this graph? Some might think of this as the Holy Grail. Can we keep increasing individual wealth while decreasing individual CO2 emissions? Others argue that this is not possible. Zero growth economists, for example, argue that what we need is to move down once we've reached a certain acceptable level of wealth, move downwards on the graph, decreasing emissions, but that it will not be possible to do this and at the same time keep increasing wealth. There's one thing that recent history tells us does work in mitigating climate change, and that's recession, which is a fancy word for a sustained level of low growth. Of course, again, for many people, having low growth would seem to be too high a price to pay for mitigating climate change. Others, such as so-called zero growth economists, argue that this is exactly what's needed and that we can't have our cake and eat it. We either have to mitigate, and that's going to cost in economic growth terms, or it's going to be business as usual. And there, according to many projections, the costs of climate change in the form of catastrophic events like droughts and floods are going to run so high towards the end of this century that indeed business as usual growth will become an impossibility.